And Jesus, if he was role modeled, you would not get that. But he's not. The usual one that is role modeled is the leader of the cult, the Machiavellian, the narcissist, the psychopathic leader who chooses, interestingly, to go after what he perceives is the weaker on that.
So imagine this. Imagine that there's a group of individuals, about 4% of the population, who have a set of personality characteristics that have been described as Dark Triad. So they're Machiavellian. They use their language to manipulate. They're narcissistic. They want unearned social status and reputation. They're psychopathic, which makes them free of empathy and parasitical and predatory. And they're sadistic. So they take positive delight in the unnecessary suffering of others.
Recently on the Joe Rogan and the Hannity Show on Fox, Jordan Peterson appeared and he made some comments about tyrannical leadership, which were excellent and very insightful, but he did make a comment about Christ King and how that model holds only to the fringe, but he didn't mean it as the Christian believers, but more so a style that these tyrannical leaders kind of emulate.
Okay, now the way those people operate is they look for what patterns of belief form groups that they can infiltrate and then capitalize on. And that happens on the right. We did a report, the same group, on the use of Christ as king as a manipulative strategy by bad actors, hypothetically on the right. And this report identified the same sort of people on the left. But it's not primarily political. They're wolves in sheep's clothing who look for where there's power and value and then adopt those beliefs as a surface camouflage so that they can elevate their moral status.
And as we see leaders of government and in the church, we see this characteristic. They call it the Dark Triad, which is signified by narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. This Dark Triad is an indicator that a leader could possibly be a very big problem.
I am all for real shepherds, real pastors. A tough job, maybe one of the hardest jobs. Not only a job that's at times physically taxing, but it is a non-stop spiritual attack on so many pastors and shepherds. But make no mistake about it, there are personality types who see this as a great opportunity to gain power, control, influence for their own desires. And so I go back to what we read in the book of Acts. Beware of those men who've risen from within, who draw away the disciples, what again? After themselves. This isn't what I've been warning about for years in my books, Religious Trojan Horse, The Coming Religious Right, Marxianity, and on countless radio shows and TV shows and documentaries.
But what needs to be understood in this video is that we need to look at our church leaders, our elders, and we need to hold them to the standard of the Bible. No ands, if, or buts. We like the guy, but he's a tyrant. That's not good enough. The church leader, pastor, needs to be loving, not fearful. He does not need to rule with an iron fist. We should have no fear to approach our leaders with the Bible and point out things that might be in error. And if we do that, we will keep them accountable. But if you get resistance when you approach your pastor about something that he may have said wrong or something he may be doing and does not want to discuss it and wants to retaliate against you, then you've got yourself someone that can be characterized by this Dark Triad.
Well, what he was referring to here is the Dark Triad that is not only in politics, but also in religion. This is not something new. If you look at the Old Testament, like Ezekiel 34, there were leaders in Israel and among the priests who had these tendencies, and Ezekiel goes through and really castigates them, and you'll see narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Now, by the way, define Machiavellianism for us. What does that mean?
Sure.
That's a figure. That's named after an individual, right?
Right. Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, and most of our politicians are taught that, at least as a tradition, as to it's better to be feared than loved, is the essence of Machiavelli's teaching. And in that way, these preachers come over and institute an atmosphere of fear and intimidation instead of love, in order to keep their control over the church. And then there's psychopathy, which is essentially this, and this is why I really want to back away from people who are very legalistic, fundamentalistic in terms of their culture, because psychopathy is the inability to empathize with someone. They cannot, for either they're born that way or they've had some trauma that's induced their inability to see empathy, to see the fear in others. They have no detection of empathy, sympathy, the gentleness of Jesus. And what is interesting is the last time I showed you a chart, the science is growing, and in terms of the top 10 professions, remember that chart that I showed you where the clergy are on the top 10, number 8 they come in as being toward psychopathy. I'm not saying they're perfect psychopaths. I'm saying they have the characteristics and the tendencies of them. They rule through fear, and they rule through intimidation. And as I was going through ministry, I began to see this and could not figure out what in the wide world was going on. But as time went on and I learned, this Dark Triad is distributed, and if you see a large mega church, and this may shock people, but that many of these mega churches are run by at least someone who has strong psychopathic tendencies of they do not empathize or sympathize, they manipulate, they rule with Machiavelli, that it's better to rule in fear, and they make life miserable on people, and yet many of these people in mega churches love it. And they'll ask them, are you bitter? This is what I've seen in particularly one group that I'm familiar with, where if they abuse people, they all learned among the leadership the phraseology, are you bitter? Well, actually, the truth is you are abusive and you need to repent of the abuse. Then third, the leader does everything and is justified, no matter how harmful what he does is, the cult will justify the leadership doing that. Fourth, and this is one I've seen especially in more Bible believing churches, or at least they say they are, the leader is the only source of truth. And he's usually in the pulpit telling people, if you don't agree with his teaching, then you don't either know what you're doing or you're not saved. There's a lot of these guys that love to pronounce their papal bull, if I may use that term, of who is saved and who isn't, and only God knows that. And then finally, the disciples, especially those in leadership, must be devoted to the leader and never question him. Questioning is wrong. And these are the 5 signs of what we have in a cult. And I'm sorry, Brandon, but a lot of these more fundamentalistic Bible church type of groups seem to develop this because the psychopath, the clergy who is towards psychopathy in his mindset tends to bring these to the surface as he rises in the church, and then everybody's in harm's way and will be abused.
You know, Jordan Peterson in his list said that these people, they try to go into the, quote, ministry, if you will, for social status. And then he said they have no empathy, no sensitivity toward people, what you've seen. And they're sadistic, meaning they seem to enjoy the suffering of others.